The third cultural dimension that we are talking about in this series of videos is the collectivism versus individualism values. Again, that has been addressed by a different number of authors. You probably find a lot of literature on that on the internet. We're just going to talk about it simply. So basically, again, a collectivism or a collectivist culture would be normally the culture with a large power distance value and high context communication. An individualist culture is normally, again, the culture with low power distance value and low context communication. So a collectivist culture is basically where the group identity is more important than the individual identity, and of course vice versa in an individualist culture. So what does that mean? So this basically means that any member of a collectivist culture, they have stronger ties with their group identity, which could be a family or a tribe. Again, I'm going to touch upon some cultures where a tribe is a big deal. Again, mostly the Arab countries in the Gulf, the Arab Peninsula, Yemen, Saudi, and others, particularly Yemen, where I've worked, and you can see how important it is that the tribal sort of validation, or the biggest tribes, they had to approve of any sort of political process or even social process. So anyone would present themselves as they belong to the tribe rather than who they are personally. In other cultures, in other collectivist cultures, it could be the families, which is often the case in Egypt. Often people would refer to their family names and say, yes, I come from that family, or my grandfather or my great-grandfather happens to be X and Y. And that is again explained by the fact that in collectivist cultures, we get to see that individuals tend to like to stick to their families. So in a collectivist culture, normally a person, be it a male or a female, would move out of their parents' place once they get married. And that could be at the age of 25 or even 30. In an individualist culture, usually they move out as they join college. So they could move out at the age of 17, 18, and they're expected to be independent. And we're going to elaborate on that a little bit more in the next slide. So again, this shows how collectivist or individuals from collectivist cultures tend to be more tied to their family. And even when they move out, often they try to live in the same building as their family or on the same street. So they're not even changing cities there. Often members of a collectivist culture choose to be closer to their families over better career opportunities, unless the economic situation in their country is quite intolerable. But again, it's often the case, and when they do go away, they're always thinking that they want to go back. So it's harder to migrate perhaps for a person from a collectivist culture. So if you look at that again, in a collectivist culture, they tend to restrain a little bit of the personal emotional expression, and they tend to protect what is known the in-group members from being held accountable for the conflict or a problem. So if there's a problem, individuals would tend to defend their group and lay the problem on themselves, or blame themselves for a problem, as opposed to an individualist culture. Here, the personal accountability is what comes into play, not really the group, the family, or the tribe, or the organization that the person is representing. People tend to take responsibility in a more of a personal manner. Now, this for now sounds a little bit too complicated, but we're going to make that a little bit simpler now, and then also the next video when we talk about conflict and how it happens and how it's being dealt with, this will be perhaps a little bit easier to understand. So again, this is related to what is known as self-perception. So a person from a collectivist culture, they perceive themselves as interdependent. And by interdependent, it means they depend on other individuals, on their group or their group. And the persons or individuals from an individualist cultures are independent. The very important bit here, and again, as we said, the high context, low power distance, and horizontal self-spectrum, I'm going to elaborate what that is in a minute. But the important thing here is that interdependent individuals they are harmony seekers, and independent individuals are rational choice makers. For an interdependent person, it's important for them to make sure that the members of their group are pleased. So they want to be in harmony. So which is not always the rational choice. So they may accept or force themselves to believe and accept some irrational logic, just because that is what will make them in harmony with their group, as opposed to an independent person. They're all about rationality. So again, the collectivist cultures are like countries in East Asia, China, Japan, Korea. Southeast Asian countries like Thailand and Vietnam. Mediterranean, Greece and Italy are actually collectivist culture. And they're somewhere in the middle between Arab countries and Northern European, Western European and Northern American countries when we're talking about communication methods. So Mediterranean, they tend to be a little bit of each side, so they're high context communication, but to a lesser extent than Arab countries, for example. And then, of course, the Middle Eastern countries, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, and the like, and some African countries. Individualist cultures are like in Europe, so the Britain, France, Germany, Scandinavian countries, North America and Australia and New Zealand as well are individualist cultures. And then, of course, it varies from one country to another. Germans tend to be more low context communicators than French, for example. French tend to go a little bit in circles, while Germans are sort of towards the end of low context communication spectrum. And that's why they might be perceived as offensive by some other low context communicators as well. So finally, we are going to talk about the meaning of trust. And it's very important. So for a person that is coming from a collectivist cultural background, for them to trust someone, this someone has to have a credible role in a reputable organization or is a tribal leader. So it's really about status. Trust here is about who this person is, because the thinking is that if this person was able to get to where they are today, be it a parliament member or a head of a big organization or a head of a big corporation, then they normally are credible and they normally are to be trusted. Or if they are well connected, they come from a big family or they have good networks. And then the last factor here is the consistency between words and actions, but it's important to note that it's action on the long-term perspective, not on the short-term perspective. As we would notice often in some of the collectivist individuals, punctuality is not really an issue. So if a person is arriving late or he says, I'll deliver on that tomorrow or after, and they deliver that on that 3 days later, the important bit here is that they actually delivered regardless of when they did it. In an individualist culture, which is also a small power distance culture, trust would be interpreted as the person being credible, reliable, punctual, persuasive. So it's really down to how the person sort of executes their job or the tasks they're bound to do, rather than who they know and what their positions is. So this is very important. Again, if you are from an individualist culture background and you're working in a collectivist cultural region, then you should know here that what people need to trust you is perhaps you say that yes, you have good relations with X and Y persons who are highly recognized in that society, for example. And if it's the other way around, if you're from a large power distance culture and you happen to be working in a small power distance individualist culture, you need to show that you're punctual, reliable, and you actually deliver on what you promise in the time you say you will do that. So for now, we will end this video, and then on the other videos, we will be talking about the uncertainty avoidance, and then we will talk about how conflicts arise between individuals from different cultural backgrounds and what are the best ways to go about resolving those conflicts.